Chapter 8, Section 1, the first president. We're going to be examining Washington's first presidency and also eventually going into John Adams through Chapter 8. But let's start off with this picture of George Washington being inaugurated in New York City. Our essential questions are pretty straightforward. What does Washington do early in his presidency? Some of the challenges, those type of things, the obstacles, some of those problems that he faces being the very first new president. And he mentions that he is walking on untrodden ground. He says no slip will go unnoticed. And we're going to also talk about his solutions, some of them successes and some of them not. So here we go. Washington is inaugurated, our first president, in New York City at Federal Hall on April 30th, 1789. And he becomes the only president to ever get all of the electoral votes possible. And so he gives a short inaugural address to a somewhat large crowd in New York City. One reason he may have given a short inaugural is a side note. When he was sworn in as our first president, he had exactly one of his original tooth in his head. All the other ones had either been pulled or rotted out, and so he had very uncomfortable dentures. And so talking with them was probably very difficult, and he did not want to do that for a long period of time.
New York City, April 30th, 1789. The inaugural. George Washington places his hand on a Bible and takes the oath of office as President of the United States of America. 4 future presidents would take the oath on that same book.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush.
You can see that Bible at Federal Hall in New York City, the site of that first swearing in. To think that his hand touched that.
Yes, and not only that, his lips actually kissed the pages in that book.
National Park Service Ranger Ed Pennell says this Bible was actually an afterthought.
Everything is prepared for the event. Soldiers were in their best uniform. City officials were in place to receive him. They come to a point where they're about to give the oath and there's no Bible.
The nearest Bible they could find from St. John's Masonic Lodge No. 1. Yes, Masonic as in Freemasons, a fraternal order known for charity, fellowship, and secrecy. 14 U.S. presidents were members, including George Washington. He's obviously held in particularly high esteem.
Indeed.
Piers Vaughn is master of St. John's Lodge, which still owns that Bible. He and 2 fellow Masons carried the Bible, which must always be escorted by 3, back to the lodge so that we could take a closer look.
This is the page on which George Washington placed his hand as he took the oath of office.
Geez, you've opened this many times, and each time do you imagine him putting his hand?
Absolutely.
Vaughn doesn't believe the Bible was some last-minute fill-in.
Now we know that George Washington was a very developed man. It seems inconceivable that he wouldn't have thought of using a Bible.
But why this Bible?
If they used a Bible which was associated with any particular church or denomination, that church would immediately declare itself the official religion of the United States of America.
The Masonic Bible, in a sense, transcended denomination.
Exactly.
The story goes that Washington took the oath on a random page. But Vaughn thinks Washington intentionally selected a passage from Genesis. Jacob blessing his 12 sons. Where Jacob blesseth his sons.
Yes.
But the father blesses his children. The father of our country took the oath.
Exactly. And that's why it just seems to be too much, to be a random
An
page.
accident. If the Bible had been randomly opened, where would it likely have been opened?
That's very weird. And so now
Oh my gosh,
Job,
the
there you
book
go.
of
The book of
Job.
Job. Cheerful reading.
Yes, the book of Job. You know, the one filled with disease, destruction, and death. And That's not a very good foot to get off on.
Probably not.
Thankfully, our new country fared much better. And so did this Bible, said to be present with Washington at the groundbreaking of the U.S. Capitol and later at his funeral.
In a way, you could say it was on that book that the executive branch of government was created.
So I hope you enjoyed the video. It's just a little bit of an extra thing about what happens at his first inauguration. So in that, we're going to talk about what he does as our very first president. And so the first thing that the book talks about and that we have to cover is that he sets these things known as precedents, these examples or traditions followed by others. And he gets started right away with the oath. So we're going to watch this short video on the oath of office, which comes from the second article of the Constitution, where it says that the person has to affirm this oath. And then Washington does something at the end that is followed by every single president after him.
It is the day of days in Washington, D.C.
The presidential
oath of office.
Here comes the inaugural parade.
Left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand.
Raise your right hand.
You will raise your right hand and repeat after me.
After me. I, William Jefferson Clinton, do solemnly swear.
I, Jimmy Carter.
I, Barack Hussein Obama.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I will faithfully execute the office.
Execute the office of President of the United States.
Will, to the best of my ability.
Eisenhower began his second term as leader, not only of America, but all free people.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Constitution of the United States.
Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson and the great strength and wisdom. Together with the body of the late president back to Washington.
The flag flies at half-staff. President Truman asks the full Roosevelt cabinet to remain in office.
So help you God. So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God. So help me God.
So help me God. So help me God. So help me God.
So help me God.
The entire country behind you. Filled with hope and patriotism.
So the very first oath, he put those 4 words in, and every president has been following that tradition. Another one that he worked on was the idea of how to address the President of the United States, what to call him. And so today we just refer to him as Mr. President, but that was something that was at the direction from George Washington. So I want to show you a short scene from the HBO series John Adams, because John Adams had a different take on that. So enjoy.
Cricket clubs. This new federal government must command respect, and titles of federal office must ensure that respect.
How long does Mr. Adams intend to wait to Assembly's time on matters of no import?
No import. No import. There is nothing of greater importance. Mr. Clay, the office of presidency must have no equal in the world. Neither dignity nor authority can be superior.
Vice President have a title in mind?
I do indeed, sir. I have several. His Highness, the President. His Esteemed Majesty, the President. Or His Excellency, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Or something of the sort.
Well, perhaps Mr. Adams has not had occasion to peruse our Constitution. It explicitly states, no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States.
These are not titles of heredity that I am proposing, but titles conferred for merit, and titles that will only accompany positions of high federal responsibility.
The motion before us is that the President be addressed as His Highness, the President of the United States of America and Protector of the rights of the same. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed?
No!
His Rotundity, the Vice President, Duke of the Braintree. Second that.
So that little clip shows you that not everything that our founders had thought up was adopted, and luckily for us. So moving on, Washington has to select his cabinet, his formal group of advisors, and so here they are. Okay, so this would be the first cabinet of the President of the United States, and we'll get through each one of them here in a second. So let's move on. Now in class, if you were here, we did share what we thought of those videos. So if you want to pause and think about those videos and have any questions, that's a good thing to do. All right, so our first and most prestigious of the cabinet level positions would be Secretary of State. That's Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, guy from Virginia. He's going to handle relations with other countries. Okay, so Secretary of State. The next one would be Secretary of the Treasury. Everybody knows Alexander Hamilton. Here he is. He's going to deal with all financial matters and money matters. Secretary of War at the time, today we call it Secretary of Defense, but that would be Henry Knox. And he's going to deal with all military issues, guns, cannons, weapons, forts, locations of forts, procurement of various types of war material and defense material. Henry Knox, here he is. He was a good friend and companion of George Washington during the Revolutionary War. He had studied all types of things about military, but even though he was not a military man by birth or come from a family, he actually was a bookseller in Connecticut, and he loved just reading about it. So he became his go-to person when he needed somebody to counsel him on military matters. And then last but not least, you have Attorney General, and his name was Edmund Randolph. You might recognize him. He was one of the people at the Constitutional Convention. He did not sign it because it did not contain a Bill of Rights. He was also the person who introduced the Virginia Plan, but he's going to be the America's first head lawyer, Edmund Randolph. As we move on, I just want to share with you what the President's cabinet looks like today. So it's obviously expanded greatly, and this is the entire list of those executive level departments, as they refer to it. We call it the cabinet. This question I would ask in class. The first department, the most recent one that was formed, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, was formed after 9/11. The attacks of 9/11 forced and pushed for the idea of a coordinated type of cabinet level position that would coordinate any of the intelligence agencies' information across various departments. So we've talked about precedents, and we've talked about picking his cabinet, and then in the book and also in the worksheet they talk about him moving into the idea of the judicial branch. The judicial branch is the smallest one that's in the Constitution. There's not really much written, And so the Congress really had to set up what today is the judicial branch that we know of. And they do that with this act called the Judiciary Act of 1789. And for all purposes, what it does is it creates the federal court system, the different levels, and that is the point of that law. So Washington also has to, of course, appoint judges to all of those various levels of courts. And the highest court in the land is the Supreme Court. So he gets to appoint all members of the United States Supreme Court. The first Chief Justice becomes John Jay. I believe there are 5 other justices at the time. John Jay is a well-known diplomat. He had helped work out the Treaty of Paris that ends the American Revolution. He had worked during the days of the Articles of Confederation with Spain when they closed the Mississippi. The idea that he's also an important kind of Federalist as well. He's one of the authors of that, so he's a very well-known person at the time. And as we move on, we're going to talk about what other problems are faced by the new president. And the biggest one is financial. The country is deeply in debt, mired in debt, and not figuring out a way to get out of debt. And they realize that this whole thing might come tumbling down if they're unable to figure it out. So it falls to Alexander Hamilton to come up with a plan. We're going to talk about that in a second. And I shared this out with everybody in school. Okay, so we're going to talk about this financial debt, this national debt that they had. But I thought it was always interesting to kind of share some of the debt situations that we've been through recently. You can sort of see this as it relates to GDP, that's gross domestic product. You can see this over a longer stretch of time dating back to before World War II, and then it kind of shooting up dramatically. And this ended way back in 2004. Again, just a different kind of look of the United States national debt over time, obviously during wars and depressions, but now you can sort of see it inching up as well. And I thought this one was very interesting. This is meaning if everyone shared the debt. So right now we're 2030, we're now 2020. So I'd say right now everyone's probably about $50,000, every man, woman, and child, if they had to estimate it. So